thank you, everyone. As goes with trust and safety, my title is a bit clickbaity. It's not going to be just about AI today, but I'm going to give an introduction a bit to trust and safety, which is like an industry that's really booming at the moment. So I'm Yu-Lan, I'm head of product at Checkstep. Checkstep's a B2B SaaS provider. We help online platforms that have user-generated content deal with their risk from user-generated content, so content risk, brand risk, and also compliance risk, which is also something I'll cover. And today I want to talk about how tech platforms generally protect their communities and make sure that their users are safe and that their brand is safe. Before we do, I'll just say that I'm like, you can maybe see it, but I'm really, really happy to be here. I've been with Data Science Festival, like presenting and participating for the last 4 years, and it's my first time in person, and it's my first time meeting the team in person, and like it makes me really happy to be here. I know my title is product manager, but like I was a data scientist and an analyst before, so I'm also really happy to be here and help in any way that I can. And maybe a quick word about myself. I'm from Belgium. I grew up in Bruges, but as you can see, I have some Chinese roots. And I moved to London about 8 years ago. However, in the last 2 years, thanks to COVID, I've been a digital nomad. I mean that in a good sense. Like, I've chosen to be a digital nomad. I haven't been expelled or anything. And fun fact, I've been to 20 countries in the last 2 years. I also thought I'll give a quick intro into maybe my transition from data to product. I wanted to share this because personally I felt really lost at some point. Like I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I thought maybe sharing this might be useful. If anyone has questions at the end, I'll be here all day. Come and find me or add me on LinkedIn. Like I'm more than happy to chat and talk. So in order to explain my road to product, I'll give you a quick course on how to write a CV. Joking, but I'll do start in chronological order. So when I started, I studied applied mathematics and software engineering at university, and the only reason I decided to study was because I was good at maths. Like there was no big like I want to do this in my career. I thought I'll do something that I think I'm good at. And then after 5 years, I was like, oh, actually, this is a lot of data. It's very technical. Let me do something that is like how to run a business and like get a bit more business sense. So I joined the Boston Consulting Group in Brussels as a management consulting. But after a year, I thought this is actually too businessy. I really miss working with large scale data and not Excel sheets with like 200 rows. So I moved to London and I joined dunnhumby, who are sponsoring today also. So I stayed there again for a year, had a lot of fun, my first UK experience. But after a year, again, I was a bit like, oh, I don't know what I want to do with my life. This is kind of like fun, but I'm looking for a bit more meaning in what I do, and I couldn't find it there in that area. So I started looking around, and I joined Facebook, now Meta, as a data scientist in advertising. Again, had lots of fun, learned a lot, and after a year I got to the same point again, and this was like the third time in my very short early career where I was like, I really don't know what I want to do, but I want to find meaning. So I started looking again. I actually interviewed with other companies. I was about to leave the company when one of the managers was like, hey, we're looking for someone in counterterrorism. And I was like, counterterrorism? Like, we do this? So I was like, cool, this kind of sounds cool, so I'll just do it. And that's how I rolled into trust and safety. Like I joined the counterterrorism team, helping people, protecting people, and helping bad stuff from happening on the platform and actually also off the platform. And I ended up staying 5 years in that team, joining other teams around suicide, self-harm, prevention, non-consensual intimate imagery, which is basically sextortion, and just helping out across the wider business. And from there, after 5 years, I got to a point where I wanted to do something new, which might be familiar for some people. And I got the opportunity to join Checkstep as a startup. Like I met the founder at Facebook. And it was a great change because at that point I knew I wanted to like get a bit out of data and do something a bit more holistic. And the advantage of joining a Checkstep, of joining a startup, is that there's so many hats to wear, and I could kind of tailor my own role. So it really allowed me to transition into product management because there was no one else doing it. And like in startups, like whatever needs doing has to be done. So whoever steps up to do it. So that's how I actually joined Checkstep, because initially I was in operations, and then I just transitioned my way into product, and it's been amazing. So I would say definitely in terms of learning, startup has been great. And also along the way, like I've just met someone else who joined the company as a product manager coming from software engineering. And I really think within tech, we just get such a broad experience, definitely as data people, because we usually get to work with the data that informs strategic decisions. So we get exposed to a lot of this strategic decision making. And I really think we're in a unique position to transition into more strategic roles into businesses, if that's something that we want. Again, I'm happy to talk about this. So yeah, that's like a 5-minute summary of like 8 years in my life. Without further ado, I want to talk a bit about trust and safety. But before we do, anyone who's had a bad experience online with content or behavior, please raise your hand. Okay, that's actually very few. Okay. That's relatively positive. I would have expected everyone to at least like have some bad experience. So when we talk about harm, this is just a list of the possible harms, but this is not exhaustive. Like you can maybe like resonate with some of these things on these slides, but sadly this is not exhaustive. And these are like different harms that we work with at Checkstep, that Facebook like tries and goes and detect. Some of these are illegal. So the first one, terrorist content and child sexual abusive material, CSAM, are illegal, meaning that if as a platform you find this type of content, you have to report it. Also, owning CSAM on your device is illegal. So if you do find that, like you as a company, you do have to think about what to do with it, because you have to both report it and you cannot own it. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg there. In terms of all the other policies, they're not necessarily illegal. So platforms decide whether or not they want to work on this. And to give you an example, it might sound obvious that as a platform you want to detect all these types of content, but actually it's not necessarily the case. So if you take the case of a gaming company, gaming companies are really keen on making sure that the player-to-player behavior is safe and that people are like respectful toward each other. However, from experience, they're less bothered about sexually suggestive content, for example, or violence or gore, definitely in like role-player games. But then if you go to online marketplaces like Etsy or Vinted, their sexual suggestive content is not great, but they're mainly focused on like people not selling illegal goods, drugs, weapons, and people not getting scammed. So again, like the shift in terms of harm, like shifts from vertical to vertical. The same thing, like we've worked with a couple creator monetization platforms, which is a fancy word for platforms like OnlyFans or Patreon. And there, the shift is really focused on whether you are who you are, definitely if you're selling goods or services. So there's a lot of like identity verification flows, age verification, definitely with platforms like OnlyFans, making sure that people are old enough to do some of the more adult stuff. And dating apps. I don't know who of you has like experience with dating apps and maybe has had some bad experiences, but so dating apps are very keen on making sure that all the interactions on their platform are safe, that there's not too much nudity being shared, definitely if it's unsolicited, and that there's no harassment or even selling of sexual services, which happens sadly often on dating apps, that people try to get you off the platform. So this kind of all sounds good on paper. I just want to also dig into the fact that this is really hard. Defining a policy, saying what is good or bad is really hard, and there's a lot of context that matters. For example, what is nudity? Like in Europe, nudity is kind of well defined, although some people might be a bit or more tolerant towards people in swimwear, for example. However, you go to Middle Eastern countries, nudity means something completely different. There, like bare shoulders might be different, head not covered might be very, very different. So cultural norms and preferences matter, and actually having worked at a company like Facebook, it's tough if you have so many different countries that have so many different norms. And so actually to illustrate this, I have a couple examples of why writing policies is just really hard. So if we think about free speech, I'll give a couple examples. Sadly, they're all Facebook examples. I don't know why, but like Facebook just gets a lot of shit because there's just a lot of content on there. So Yeah, I don't know. So Facebook banned mastectomy nipple tattoo pictures. So I'll just give a bit of context. I'm a data scientist. I'm sitting in my office at my desk. I sit at the window. I sat at the window in Oxford Circus, and this giant inflatable nipple pops up next to my window. And so actually this is a real story. So what happened is that Facebook has an adult nudity policy, and this means no genitals, no nipples, except male nipples are allowed, female nipples are not. Whether you agree with this, that's another story. And then over time, they started adding rules. Female nipples are allowed if they're half covered, if they're breastfeeding. But then what happened is that because of the AI taking down nipples, female nipples on the platform, some businesses got their pages disabled because I think after maybe like 5 content removals, your account gets taken down, and once you're in the Facebook jail, it's really hard to get out of it unless you know someone who can help you within the company. And so what was happening is that there are tattoo artists who really specialize in tattooing nipples for women who had their breasts reconstructed after surgery. And so their businesses were being shut down. And as Facebook, like, they didn't want that to happen. Like, Facebook's really about encouraging businesses on the platform. So what happened is that they instated a rule. And so you end up with like an adult nudity policy with more exceptions to the rule than the actual rule. Just to illustrate like that it's not always black and white. The other example is the iconic picture of a naked girl running away after a napalm attack in Vietnam. Again, Facebook has a child safety policy, so there's AI that runs and that detects whether there's nudity and whether that nudity involves children. So the AI takes down this image, which is fine, right? Because on the letter of the policy, this is a naked child. So we took it down, and then there's some backlash around removing something that has a cultural value. So again, it adds exceptions to the rules. And I just wanted to add a non-Facebook example where Twitter bans President Trump's account permanently. We now know that it's not that permanent. But again, like this was quite big news because Twitter is really liberal, but they did decide to take down the account because of incitement of violence. And again, this is black or white. It's not black or white. I can imagine that some of you in the room are like, oh, why did they take down the account? I mean, some of you might actually agree that it happened. And there's no right answer. Usually these policies in companies get defined after lots of discussions. Companies try to bring in different stakeholders to decide what the rule is. And then once the rule is there, like usually they stick with it until someone comes and protests with a big inflatable nipple at an office. And then the same happens for privacy, and I think privacy definitely now is like a big deal with generative AI coming up more and more, and lots of like shady things happening there as well. Oh, let me actually remove the search bar. Here we go. So in terms of privacy, this is a bit a trickier issue, and again, like lots of different opinions fly around. So in this case, what happens is like a dad took a picture of their child's groin to send it to a doctor because it was swollen. So he took it with his phone. It probably uploaded to the cloud, Google Cloud. Google Cloud runs a scan, and all of a sudden, like, the police is investigating him. He lost access to his phone because he was using Google Fi in the US. He lost access to his email, everything. And I know it might not sound like a big deal, but if you would lose access to all your online devices, it's probably a bit like, it's not like life-threatening, but it's a bit annoying. And so this raises the question whether Google has the right to do this. If you're taking a picture with your phone and you upload it for like a backup, like, is it okay for companies to run this type of detection? Definitely in this case, it's questionable. If this was real child pornographic material, probably like the opinions would be different. But yeah, so this raises the question around like, what is privacy, and do tech companies have the right to scan this type of content? The other one was that terrorists are really good at escaping detection. So as we move to a world that is more and more encrypted, bad actors sadly thrive off this. Like they kind of know that some platforms are encrypted and they use that, which means less safety. And the third aspect here is that for people who know, like as I mentioned earlier, like CSAM, so child abusive material, is illegal. And Facebook does a lot of work on detecting this type of content and reporting it to this institute called NCMEC, National Center of Exploited and Missing Children in the US. And NECMEC actually has this organization where they hash the images so that there's only the fingerprint that remains and share it with other platforms so that this content can be detected at scale. And Facebook is actually one of the major drivers of these databases. So it's not only imagery, but also grooming. So whenever usually adult men, like I don't want to generalize or stereotype too much, but usually adult men try and like approach children for some shady behavior, lots of this can get detected on Facebook Messenger and gets detected, and like children's lives have been saved, many, many lives. And so when Facebook's introducing encryption on Messenger, which is now possible, but only through opt-in, but they want to maybe roll it out like just as a default, FBI and other law enforcement instances are telling Facebook not to move towards privacy. So again, like it's just really tricky. As I said, there's no right or wrong. I think lots of people have different opinions, but it's very hard to like draw the line on where to add the policy there. So coming back to trust and safety, I think people are not super familiar with the term. I think people are very familiar with the term content moderation, but I think by now, after these couple examples, hopefully you know that it's more than just content moderation. Everything I've spoken about so far doesn't involve much moderation. So trust and safety as an organization, like I'm kind of promoting the industry as well, is really highly interdisciplinary. It's like, I personally find it a super exciting space to be in. Lots of things are happening right now. And it constitutes of different components. One is policy. So as we just mentioned, like there's a whole team, or like depending on how big your company is, there's usually maybe one person or many people who write policies, who help define what the company policies are depending on the company's values. Some companies like want to be transparent, some companies don't really care. So there's that aspect within trust and safety. There's the technology part, which is the AI part. That's why I said it's clickbaity, because like so far this is the first thing I mentioned about AI, where we built detection, we built prevention, enforcement, and then there's also the operations part. So you might have heard about content moderators. Facebook employs many smaller platforms employ content moderators as well. And that means people who will actually review content. Because even though AI is powerful and you can detect content, if there's terrorist content or there's child abusive material and you're going to like arrest someone, you better have a human look at it before you maybe like have a false positive, because that's kind of shitty. So this means that within trust and safety, there's a whole organization focused on managing people, managing workforce. This is like a ticketing system, so tooling is made to help these moderators review content, parallelize systems, making sure that two people are not reviewing the same type of content. And then there's other organizations. Outreach in bigger companies are teams that focus on working with law enforcement. So for bigger platforms, law enforcement might actually come in and ask companies for data. And for example, for Facebook, again, like I'm not bashing on Facebook, I just know a lot because I worked there. They actually publish the data of like how many times law enforcement were asked for data. And in some cases, Facebook has to give that data about certain people, about certain organizations. And then there's compliance, legal investigations. So I'll talk a bit about the workflow, which gets into the more technical part. In terms of the workflow, prevention is, like personally, I think the best policy. It's better to prevent something bad from happening than having to clean up the platform. So the first thing there is transparency and education. So once policies are there, I don't know how many of you have actually looked at the policies of the platforms that you use. Probably not many. They're always like hidden at the bottom. They say like community guidelines, for example, or platform policies. But it's really important that users know what they can and cannot do. Very often things happen because people don't have any bad intent, but they just post their personal address online or their bank account details. And I think there's a lot of things that we can avoid by educating users that that's actually quite dangerous to do. The second thing is we can add, I call it strategic product friction, although like I think generally it's better to call it features in public. One aspect is what I mentioned, is age and identity verification. In some cases, it's actually good to know who you are on platforms. In some other cases, actually being anonymous might be more helpful. If you're a journalist, for example, and you're looking at areas where your life might be in danger if your real identity is known. So again, privacy versus safety. There's also ways in a product to add friction. So if someone's about to post or upload an image on a platform, AI can detect whether or not that text, for example, is hate speech, and maybe add a prompt of like, are you sure you want to post this? We think this might go against your against our guidelines. Or we can prevent some users from signing up before they sign up by looking at the IP addresses, like blacklisted emails, IP addresses, for example. So there's lots of ways that prevention can happen. Once, like, if prevention doesn't happen, there's detection. So in terms of detection, you can imagine like there's different technologies in AI that will detect images, videos, audio, and text, and these are all, probably you're very well aware that these are all very different technologies, and like, for example, video detection is like super costly, so there's also like a way of how to reduce this cost. But not only the different formats, once you bring it together into like a profile, like how do you combine these signals, and if you have different languages and cultural norms, how do you kind of get these signals, like do you translate everything to English and then run a classifier? You'll probably lose a bit of context and nuance there. And in addition to that, in some areas, like there's lots of code words, like green bird in terrorism doesn't mean green bird. So yeah, there's a lot of context that is required in addition to just detecting genitals on an image, for example, or a terrorist logo. So that's where proactive detection comes in. There's AI and heuristics. So there's a whole range of AI out there, lots of AI vendors who specialize in very specific AI to detect this type of content. But honestly, I believe in simplicity, and very often heuristics work very well as well. So very often startups start with some heuristics like keywords, some rules, if this, then that. And very often a little goes a long way. And heuristics are also really handy when something goes viral, because then like it's easy to set up. Although now with GPT you can kind of train a classifier in like a couple seconds, so maybe that doesn't hold anymore. Behavioral networks. So sometimes just detecting content is not enough. One example is that if an adult male is on a messaging app and they're messaging minors that are not within their network, maybe something to look at. The same thing if you sign up to like a marketplace like an Etsy or an eBay, and all of a sudden you start messaging people at scale, probably a bit weird behavior. You might want to have a look into that. And then similarly, if a platform decides that someone is a bad actor and clearly is like maybe has terrorist or like extremist behavior, it might also be useful to have a bit of a look into their network and see, because usually these people don't act alone. So behavioral and network detection is a very different type of beast compared to just pure content detection. And then actually the most useful technology so far at scale is hashing. At Facebook, again, if you go look at the transparency reporting, they take down millions and millions of content, and most of that content is actually taken down through hashing. So there's a lot of work that goes into deciding whether a piece of content is violating. Like you need a detection, someone needs to build a detection, usually it goes to a moderator, they have to review it, sometimes there's double review, sometimes a user appeals it. So it's very costly, but then once that piece of content is actually known to be bad, it can be put in a repository, and if someone else uploads the same type of content, you can just take it down without having to go through that whole flow, and that's like much cheaper. However, privacy. So what's happening now in the industry is that these images and videos like get a fingerprint, and rather than comparing to the image directly, like the fingerprints are compared. And that's a really scalable way. And I actually just want to mention that within child sexual abusive material and terrorism, there are global organizations who are actually gathering these fingerprints from tech companies and sharing them with other tech companies. So it's a great, great effort to like have a federated system where if one company does a bit of effort, the other company can also benefit from it, and in that way, like we can take down really bad stuff at scale by sharing. Again, privacy issues, and definitely if it's global, US, EU, there's a bit of issues there, but it's a great effort. And I wanted to call out stopnci.org. They're a UK effort, so I think something we can all be proud of. It's an effort created by the Revenge Porn Hotline. I don't know if people are aware of the Revenge Porn Hotline. I hope you don't, but if you have, you probably know what this is. So basically it's extortion. So what happens is that people might share intimate imagery, which don't have to be nudes. It can also be like just a text that was private and that people will screenshot and share with others to coerce people into maybe sharing more nudes, into like bullying, into getting money out of people. And sadly, that's like a real problem. Sadly, also the ratio is more women being victim of this. And so what the Revenge Porn Hotline has done is that they've worked with Facebook and Instagram initially to create Stop NCII. And the basic concept is that you share your nudes with the tech platforms. And so if they find it, they will take it down. Obviously, people are not comfortable sharing their nudes with Facebook, so they go through Stop NCI, which is an independent nonprofit, and the technology behind it is that your images get hashed on your device. So you're actually not sending an image to the tech platform, you're just sending the fingerprint. And so it's a great organization. They now work with, I think, Bumble, TikTok, Reddit, I think that's it, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Bumble, and Reddit. And it really helps people, like victims, control a bit the damage that can be done by this. And then the last aspect is reactive detection. So there's user reporting and external events. So on many platforms, as a user, you can report content, and that's actually also really helpful. And from a data science point of view, it's also a really good signal for like false positives, although it also gets abused, because as you can imagine, content gets reviewed by humans, so humans make mistakes. So if someone reports the same content like 100 times, then at some point a mistake will be made, and like the wrong decision will be made, and it falls through the cracks. And then external events, like if some journalist comes up with, I found this content online, that's also a very good signal to go and try and improve detection. The third aspect is enforcement. So once you found content, so the whole AI part very often goes to like finding content, but once you found it, what do you do with it? Like what is acceptable? In cases like nudity, it's quite easy to scale. Like it's very easy to detect genitals on images, so it's very easy to be like, we'll just take it down, no human intervention needed. But very often we need human moderation, so have that extra layer of people who look at a piece of content. And just to give an example, for example, even if there's a terrorist logo, like at Facebook, human moderation will intervene, because if someone is condemning terrorism, that's kind of allowed on the platform. But so tell an AI to like get the nuance, get the context, it's a bit tricky. So that's why we need human moderation. So this means that the decisions that we can take is like what they call hard actions. Just remove the content, disable the user. I don't know if some of you have like had disabled accounts, but that's like the hardest action that one can take. Then there's softer actions, which is downranking, for example. Downranking content, shadow banning. I don't know, it's a term that's kind of like hot definitely in Europe at the moment, basically meaning that you as a user, you get shadow banned, so you can interact on the platform, but no one will see your content, and you're not aware of it. So it's borderline. You can remove discoverability, like remove items from search results, from recommendation engines, and then like users can be temporarily disabled. Or another action is asking users to change. So some platforms will say like, oh, you've uploaded this piece of content on your profile, can you please change it, because we don't allow it. And a third action is external reporting. So in some cases, platforms have to report to law enforcement. So that's another type of enforcement. Adapt. So in terms of adapting in the workflow, it basically means data. Data is power here. It's like what is happening on the platform, and continuous monitoring is one of them. So understanding the platform health is important. How much bad content is on your platform? Like, is there a way to measure this? And there's a lot of statistical methods to measure what they call prevalence, like sampling, and then using that sample ratio to estimate the extrapolated proportion of bad content, which is trickier when that content is like very low in prevalence. But then the other aspect is adversarial behavior. So bad actors are really, really, really good at finding out a new detection, a new way, and like going around it. Maybe a very simple example there is keywords. Very often platforms have keyword detection, so if at some point like the word suicide is forbidden, they will try and write suicide with 2 S's, or add typos, or add emojis. And that's just an example of adversarial behavior of actors. So basically this problem is never solved. That's why I think it's such an exciting space. And so having data to understand what is happening there is also really important in terms of monitoring. There's AI explainability and fairness. I think like there's been a lot of news articles on fairness. Lots of times data gets trained on maybe white, male, US, English languages. And so there's inherent bias in lots of these models, and having data to understand where that bias is and how that impacts the ecosystem is super important. And then the last aspect is A/B testing. A/B testing in terms of rolling out new classifiers, new models to be able to understand what's happening before rolling out at full scale. But then again, like in trust and safety, it can be a bit tricky sometimes to do A/B testing or having holdouts, because you wouldn't want to have a 5% holdout who gets exposed to like illegal content, for example. So there's a bit of like judgment that goes into there, into what is a good A/B test, or maybe doing a back test, or have some trends analysis, and then like kind of deal with some of the less clear aspects on whether that's seasonality or not. And the last aspect is compliance. So this might be a bit boring. I think it's pretty exciting at the moment. Trust and safety as a space is becoming more and more regulated. That's driven by big tech, like all the examples of things that went wrong, like over time accumulate, and at some point regulators are like, hey, this is not supposed to happen. And then more recently, regulations have been driven by the generative AI changes. I don't know if anyone's aware that in the EU, the AI Act is being written and developed and is going to impact platforms and OpenAI alike. For example, I think in the AI Act, they're now saying that the providers using generative AI will have to comply with transparency standards and some metrics. So meaning that like if you use OpenAI, like OpenAI will have to provide visibility into whether content was AI generated, but then you as a platform also have to like comply with a ton of things if you serve users in the EU. So there's the regulations, and the two main ones are the Digital Services Act in Europe and the Online Safety Bill in the UK. Initially, we thought the OSB, Online Safety Bill, would get there sooner, but because of like change in prime ministers, the bill has been going a bit back and forth. But actually, the Online Safety Bill scares platforms the most because I think, I don't know, 6 or 10% of global turnover in terms of fines. But the main thing with the OSB is that at the moment, as an executive, you can get into jail if you don't like cooperate. So it's scaring a lot of people, because if you're in a small company with 100 people and your ass is on the line, like it's a bit scary. And then the Digital Services Act is already being being enforced for large platforms, and will be enforced in February next year. And to give a couple ideas on what these rules and regulations want to achieve, they mainly want to achieve like transparency and accountability. For example, in Europe, every time you get enforced, you will, like, it's mandatory for the platform to let you know, meaning that things like shadow banning, meaning like you can use the platform and you can't interact with anyone but you don't know it, will become kind of useless because the platform will have to let you know. So not only will the platform have to let you know what's happening against you, but you also have the right to appeal. So that's one thing. And then there's transparency reporting. So platforms will have to report on the content that they take down every quarter, half a year, or a year, and age verification. So definitely in the Online Safety Bill, access to minors is very important. So if you are a platform or work with a platform that has children, there is a lot of changes that are going to happen. And again, there's a debate there on whether people should be anonymous or whether like identity should be verified online or not. And then another is privacy regulations. I think everyone knows GDPR, but there's also this other regulation called the e-privacy directive, which in Europe makes it illegal to scan private messages. So to the discussion that we had earlier around encryption, that's one thing, but then in Europe, we cannot scan private messages. And there's a couple discussions happening because the Online Safety Bill actually wants to create a loophole into this to detect terrorism content and CSAM in private messaging. So there's like really interesting things happening of things that are completely opposed. And to give an example, I think is the Online Safety Bill and the Digital Services Act. I think both platforms like Wikimedia and Wikipedia, which everyone uses and lots of AI models are trained upon, they at the moment cannot comply with some of the regulations, and so they're threatening to leave the UK because they just cannot comply with some of the reporting and identity verification. So there's some really, really interesting and weird things happening in this space. So I think this was the last part. I hope you learned something about trust and safety. I just wanted to say, like, historically, people roll into trust and safety by accident because very often people start in customer support and end up being in trust and safety. But I hope as we go forward as an industry that more and more people choose to be here and like want to help make the internet a safer place. Thank you.
Thanks, Yu-Lan. That's really interesting. I think it was interesting that so few people put their hands up at experiencing online harm, but then I looked at the list and there's things like spam, which we're all getting. It's interesting how much bad behaviour has become normalised. So it's a really important area, I think. Questions, please.
Do you think there's an industry in particular which is not making enough effort in online trust and safety?
Depends. I think every industry is doing an effort in some way because their brand depends on it. There are platforms out there that just care a bit less, like Gab, for example. But I would say most industries just care because there's a financial incentive to do so. And with the regulations coming up, there'll be even more incentives to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, it was very interesting. I was just going to ask, you mentioned human moderation. I was just wondering, to what extent is that, what proportion of it is human versus AI? How significant is that? And then obviously in terms of what support can there be or should there be for the human moderators? Because obviously that's seeing a lot of explicit of content on the daily. What support can there or should there be?
Two very good questions. So the first question in terms of what proportion, it depends on platform to platform. Some platforms that we work with, they want to review everything, like everything that gets triggered humanly. Some platforms want to review everything, want to action everything automatically because of cost. So it really varies between platforms. And in terms of support, technically so lots of moderation gets outsourced for bigger companies through BPOs. And technically, on paper, they have to provide like 20% mental health time off and get support. I know in practice it sadly doesn't always happen. There's things that we can do though as an industry, like we build a moderation tooling. So there's things that you can do, like you can, of the content that comes in, try and like balance the severity so that it's not always like the super severe stuff, so that a moderator sees a bit of like, I mean, it's still bad things, but maybe a bit less bad. We can like blur images. If it's audio or video, it's usually really useful to like extract the audio into text and highlight bad words so that they don't have to listen to the audio or just like look at specific frames in the video. So there's things that we can do. There's things that like moderator companies can do, I think, better. So yeah, it depends. And then lots of companies have in-house moderators, and usually from like what I've seen, they have it a bit better because they're a team and they work together and they have a bit less pressure to perform because big companies usually have very tight SLAs, so people have to review content very quickly. Thank you.
Hi, I want to ask for Checkstep as a business. How do you set the standard for trust and safety? Because ultimately you're providing a service to businesses which have various levels of, let's just say, ethical and moral values.
Yes.
So do you actually have a score that you tweak, or they provide you a guideline and you follow it through?
So it goes both ways. Platforms that we work with, if they're a bit bigger, usually have their own guidelines. If they're a bit smaller, we help them with what we call off-the-shelf guidelines, and then we tweak it. But to your question, some platforms are fine with a bit more nudity, some are not, and so we're able to tailor that for different platforms. But you as a business, do you have your internal guidelines? We have our internal guidelines, yes.
Hello, thank you for the very informative talk. I'm very interested in, as you said, there are a lot of challenges when doing A/B testing, when you try to roll out a new trust and safety policy. Mm-hmm. Could you give us an example of the previous A/B testing or other back testing you've done? And what are the challenges and how do you address those? Thank you.
It's been a while that I've run A/B testing, but the main challenge was around measuring the impact. Because in an ideal setting, you'd measure the impact of a population that has a certain classifier and a population that doesn't. But it's very, personally, I think, unethical to like have 5% of people who are exposed to certain things. So that's where it becomes tricky. And then usually, like, instead of A/B testing, can do historical analysis instead of pure A/B testing.
Time for one more quick question.
I think it's a great talk. Thank you. A lot of the examples you gave were about particular types of situation, but could you talk about the challenges of dealing with misinformation, which I guess is really, really grey in a lot of cases?
Yes. Well, I'm maybe not the best person. Actually, my CEO built a tech company that got acquired by Facebook to deal with misinformation. But the tricky thing with misinformation is that it's quite subjective. And that's why it's really hard. And that's why actually to the discussion around policies is that platforms in that case should be a bit more clear on what they allow and don't allow, but then that creates a backlash of people who have different opinions. But it is trickier because it's not only like where is the threshold, but then again, if there's translations happening and different cultural contexts, it's so subjective and personal that it creates a lot of tension, I would say. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank Yu-Lan again.
Thank you.